Our presentation is about how climate change is fueling wildfires in Central Oregon. We chose Central Oregon and its ongoing challenges with wildfires because it represents a region where climate change impacts are already being observed in real time. Declining snowpack, drier conditions, and changing precipitation patterns are all contributing to an increase in wildfire activity across Oregon. We thought this made a strong case study because it shows how interconnected climate issues really are. Wildfires don't just affect forests, they also impact nearby communities economically through rising insurance costs, damage to homes and infrastructure, and poor air quality from smoke exposure. We also chose this topic because it highlights how difficult adaptation can be whenever environmental, political, and economic challenges are all overlapping at once. Throughout this presentation, we're going to cover what and where this issue is occurring, who is affected, how these impacts are unevenly distributed, who the key stakeholders are, and the major trade-offs and complexities involved in adaptation decisions. We will also discuss what makes wildfire adaptation in Central Oregon such a difficult problem without simple solutions.
Who is affected? With a reduction in snowpack and an increase in wildfire risk, these are some of the most influential impacts of climate change surrounding forest ecosystem health. Both are related to warming temperatures observed across the Pacific Northwest, so reduced snowpack affects the forest by changing availability of water throughout the drier parts of the year. And historically, snowpack has acted as a reservoir by slowly releasing water into soils during the summer months. With the reduction in snowpack, this will lead to drier soils during the summer, further stressing the forest, making it more prone to drought, disease, and wildfires. As mentioned, wildfire risk is increasing in these drier and hotter conditions. These drier conditions increase the amount of fuel for fires as well as the length of fire season. This allows fires to become more intense in size, which makes them harder to contain. While wildfires are a natural part of the ecosystem, the increased intensity is making regeneration efforts more difficult. Furthermore, the fires are releasing large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, further exacerbating the problem of climate change. This all impacts many different groups that rely on the forest. These include native tribes, low-income communities, rural communities, utility companies, the timber industry, and agriculture. Most importantly, the forest ecosystem is affected the most. And these key variations in vulnerability can include, but are not limited to, income, race, age, and geography.
How impacts are unevenly distributed, geographical distributions. Climate change is expected to significantly alter the geographical distribution of plant species across the Pacific Northwest. As temperatures rise and precipitation patterns change, many plant species will no longer be able to survive in parts of their current ranges, while other areas may become newly suitable. Research shows that plants respond individually to climate change based on their specific temperature and moisture tolerances rather than shift together as a whole. Therefore, forests and other ecosystems may reorganize over time as species shift toward more suitable habitats. For example, subalpine trees like lodgepole have already shifted in certain mountainous regions. Scientists have already observed changes in plant distributions, such as shifts in subalpine tree populations, and models project even larger future changes. For example, Douglas fir may lose suitable climate conditions across large portions of Washington by the 2060s, while several pine species vulnerable to mountain pine beetles are expected to lose much of their climatically suitable habitat. Some species may move toward higher elevations or cooler northern areas, but others may decline substantially as suitable habitat disappears faster than they can adapt or migrate. Climate models also suggest broader ecosystem changes across the region, including decreases in forests and grasslands in some areas and expansion of desert shrub under hotter and drier conditions. Although there is uncertainty in the exact magnitude of these changes, the overall scientific consensus is that climate change will reshape where many Northwest plant species and ecosystems can survive. How impacts are unevenly distributed effects on humans. Low-income communities are often hit harder by climate change impacts because they have fewer financial resources to prepare for and recover from disasters like heat waves, wildfire smoke, and floods. In the Pacific Northwest cities, historically red line neighborhoods, communities with significant Asian, Black, and immigrant populations, categorized during the New Deal era, in lower income areas can be significantly hotter than wealthier neighborhoods because they have fewer trees and more pavement. The CDC reports some formerly red line Northwest communities can be up to 15 degrees hotter than city averages. Elderly people, children, and young people. Older adults are especially vulnerable to extreme heat, wildfire smoke, respiratory disease, and isolation during disasters. According to the CDC, they are one of the highest risk groups because they are more likely to have chronic conditions, mobility limitations, and are less able to regulate body temperature. Wildfire smoke is another major risk. Studies cited by the CDC found that smoke exposure increased respiratory hospitalizations among adults over 65 in the Western United States. USDA Climate Hubs notes that youth are particularly vulnerable to climate-related mental health impacts because they will experience cumulative climate effects over their lifetimes. Rural communities in the Pacific Northwest are especially vulnerable because their economies often depend directly on climate-sensitive natural resources, such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and outdoor recreation. Additionally, rural workers face heightened exposure to wildfire smoke, extreme heat, and dangerous working conditions outdoors. The CDC states that climate change threatens traditional foods such as salmon and berries, roots, and wildlife that tribes and indigenous peoples have historically relied on. Climate change also affects tribal sovereignty and self-determination because tribes often face underinvestment, limited infrastructure, historical displacement, and barriers to resources. The U.S. Forest Service emphasizes that Indigenous peoples experience climate change impacts differently because of deep relationships with ancestral lands and cultural practices tied to ecosystems.
Wildfire adaptation in Central Oregon is challenging because there is no perfect solution. As temperatures rise and snowpack declines, wildfire seasons are becoming longer and more severe, and many adaptation strategies help reduce wildfire risk, but they can also create trade-offs for different groups across the region. One major strategy is forest thinning and logging. Removing dense vegetation and dead trees can help reduce fuel buildup and lower wildfire intensity. It can also support rural communities and timber jobs in the communities near Bend, Sisters, and Prineville. However, increased logging can negatively impact wildlife habitats and ecosystems, and some tribal and environmental groups worry about the long-term ecological effects. Another strategy is prescribed burning. Controlled burns help remove excess vegetation and restore more natural fire cycles in Central Oregon's dry forests. While prescribed burns can help reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires, they can also create smoke that affects air quality and public health, especially for younger groups such as children, older adults, and people with respiratory conditions. Communities are also investing in home hardening, which involves using fire-resistant materials and also clearing vegetation around homes. These strategies have been proven to improve safety and reduce property damage, but they are also very expensive and not equally accessible for all rural and low-income residents. Water management is becoming increasingly important as reduced snowpack and drought conditions limit water availability. Conservation efforts can help support agriculture, growing cities, and wildfire preparedness, but they also create competition between farmers, urban communities, tribal nations, and ecosystems that rely on cold water streams and rivers. Overall, wildfire adaptation in Central Oregon is complex because environmental protection, economic livelihoods, water access, and community safety are all interconnected.
We're specifically focusing on a case study looking at wildfires in Central Oregon. So let's get into the data. Historically, looking at Central Oregon, which we are defining as Deschutes, Jefferson, and Crook County, we see some small fires near the northern edges of Jefferson County and scattered throughout Deschutes County. Wildfire is relatively light in Crook County. When looking at recent fires, so this is spanning from 2000 to 2024, we see that along the northeastern edge of Jefferson County, or near the edge of the Cascades, there's a drastic increase in wildfires. We also see some wildfires up near the Warm Springs Reservation. Wildfires also seem to have increased in Crook County, where, if you'll remember before, there were barely any. Bend seems to be about the same, except for in its northwestern edge. So let's talk about the reasons that this fire may be increasing. Part of this may be due to fire suppression during the 20th century. This has led to a buildup of leaf litter and low-growing vegetation, which can make forest fires spread much faster and burn longer. This was talked about before with how prescribed burns can help to reduce this risk. Of course, this has to do with more than fire suppression. Looking at this chart from Deschutes County, we can clearly see from the 1920s to the 1980s, there's strong fire suppression in effect. The relative amount of acres burned is fairly low, but starting in 1990, as fire suppression begins to ease, we see a return to about average. It's slightly higher, which would make sense with fire suppression leaving extra leaf litter and other things that make it easier for fire to spread. We also see, though, a trend from 1990 to 2010 suggesting that there is something else causing an increase in the acreage burned. There's also been a steady increase in temperatures, dryness, and reductions in snowpack due to climate change. So let's look at the data here. Fire season spans from May to October, and we can see during May to October, maximum temperatures have been steadily raising since 1980 at a rate of about 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. Minimum temperatures have also increased. So this means that during summers, there are more hot days, leading to dry vegetation, and less cool days that could help mitigate fire or just generally allow plants to hold on to more moisture. And we see this reflected in drought indices. So we're seeing less snow water equivalent, which is essentially the amount of water that's stored in snowpack. This is looking specifically at the Warm Springs Reservation, which is in the northeastern half of Jefferson County, which you'll remember had a massive increase in fires. And we can see with climate projections that this snow water equivalent is projected to only decrease going forward. Also looking at the standardized precipitation and potential evapotranspiration index, which takes into account both precipitation and rising temperatures, we can see that around 2015, there's a very rapid increase in drought conditions. So this dry vegetation and lack of water leads to more fires starting, but it also creates ethical dilemmas. Because we have less water, we have to choose whether we want to use that for preventing fires or for agriculture, and we also have to decide which communities we want to prioritize first. Finally, we can look at something that's very important in Central Oregon. In the Oregon area, we have what are called Mediterranean summers. So generally, we have very wet winters, but our summers are increasingly dry. Because of this, we generally would prefer to have a longer winter season. This allows for more buildup of snowpack, and it means that there's less time throughout the year when we're going to be experiencing drought-like conditions. As you can see from these two graphs, though, freezes and generally cooling of temperatures are happening later and later in the year, whereas seasons are also ending earlier with the last spring freeze, which if you look back at 1980 was occurring around June 8th to June 1st, is now occurring closer to May 20th.
So these are some of the key stakeholders when it comes to wildfire risk and management. Ultimately, everyone in the area is affected by fires in some way, whether that's due to air quality, policy change, or fire risk to homes. These are just some of the general groups who have entered the conversation when it comes to the issue of wildfires in Central Oregon. So the first one is going to be policymakers. A few days ago, I believe it was Wednesday, Oregon lawmakers attended a meeting in Portland to discuss the concerns related to wildfire, and they left with concerns regarding Oregon's preparedness for the fire season. This is due to budget cuts and the loss of personnel in the U.S. Forest Service, despite there being an increase in firefighters due to wage increases. And there are 32 million acres of federal land in Oregon, which the government is responsible for, and it is necessary to coordinate between federal, state, and local agencies to make sure that all areas are prepared for wildfire risk. The second group is logging companies. Due to the increase in wildfire risks, the forest land values have decreased by 50%. Logging companies are needing to harvest before prime harvesting time because every year that they wait is a gamble of whether those areas are going to be burned down. Heavy logging was used to thin out forests and was thought to help with the spread of wildfire, but this turns out to be false. And it turns out that corporate owned tree farms were found to burn at a 30% higher severity than other areas. The third community is rural and low income communities. One study showed that socially vulnerable people in Central Oregon were found to be disproportionately exposed to fire risk. And this is because these communities often do not have equal access to resources. For example, evacuation plans are difficult to manage, as well as managing houses to keep up with fire-related regulations. And also in these areas, because they're in a high-risk area, typically changes in insurance prices and coverage are causing difficulties for homeowners. This is very high in the Lapine area of Oregon. And the last key group of stakeholders is the Indigenous communities. As mentioned before, Indigenous communities do have historical ties to the land as well as ties to fire management practices such as controlled burns. Geographically, Indigenous communities tend to be in higher risk areas and they often have inadequate access to federal resources for fire management. This leads to higher fire risk in those areas, and also this fire loss greatly affects them culturally as it disrupts their land and their cultural food sources.
Why is adapting to wildfire so challenging? One of these aspects is the growing wildland-urban interface. As urban sprawl continues to expand, more and more homeowners are more well connected with landscapes that have high fire potential. This combines with conflicting landowner values. For example, some landowners may prefer to not manage their land for fire, or they may not have the funding to properly manage their land for fire, as some landowners near them do manage their land for fire. There's also a huge community-based effort in managing for wildfire in the wildland urban interface. Another portion of this is management is very expensive. Reducing fuel loads on private lands and federal lands alike is a very expensive endeavor, of which not all people can afford. According to Nowak and Walton, in their article from 2005, urban land is projected to increase from 3.1% to 8.1% by 2050, affecting up to 118,000 kilometers of the wildland urban interface. Another challenge to adapting to the growing risk of wildfire is historic fire suppression, as previously mentioned, has increased the risk for wildfire severity and wildfire ignition potential. Historic wildfire suppression has increased the buildup of fuels on the landscape, stemming from the 10 a.m. policy introduced in the 1920s by the U.S. Forest Service. The 10 a.m. policy was essentially the U.S. Forest Service goal to put out all wildfires by 10 a.m. Putting all these fuels on the landscape creates greater connectivity between fire on the forest floor and fire in the canopy, which running crown fires in the canopy are a big reason of why wildfires spread so quickly. Another problem related to fire suppression is federal cuts. There have been recent federal cuts to wildfire suppression just in the last couple of years. This reduction in staffing has created a major problem going forward in suppressing wildfire. Another issue in adapting to wildfire is the reduced snowpack we're currently experiencing, as well as future trends in projected snowpack. The figure on the bottom left also shows maximum consecutive dry days with very little precipitation below 0.2 millimeters. As you can see by the graph from the climate toolbox, these box plots show the maximum consecutive dry days increasing in the future. with global climate trends. This shows that these consecutive dry days increase fire potential in the Pacific Northwest. The climate is also forecasted to trend for warmer, hotter, drier summers, all contributing to wildfire management.